you touched on something I think it's important to highlight. The fact that when a university like Tufts makes a conclusion like Lucky Charms are better than beef, it doesn't just impact the public who might, read the New York Times article that features that. It's going to impact policy in the public, like how the school systems, what they bring into the schools, and you touched on this, or even the hospitals, the jails. Like this becomes the standard that we have to follow. So it's beyond what we can even control in our own homes.
Oh yeah. So this is where the top down, we can't totally wash our hands of that. There is some trust and deference that we should give to our institutions. And I'll give you an example of exactly how this works. So we all kind of, some of us on this metabolic health journey, there's this stereotype of like the kids' birthday parties and they're all being served sugar. And, I go to our child's daycare and, he's the weird kid who doesn't have any of the food that they serve because it's actually, I think, reprehensible. You go to any daycare in this country and they're serving sugar. The kids are frankly, like little meth addicts. Sugar impacts the brain in the same way as an illicit drug. And you truly have, a true addiction crisis among most young children in this country. But the key there, Jesse, is this is actually following recommendations of our government. So the USDA today says that a 2-year-old can have 10% of their diet as added sugar. So how did that happen? How does the US government tell us that a 2-year-old advise that they have up to 10% of their diet added sugar, which is essentially like saying 10% of your diet should be heroin. You're actually, it's actually in the way that it's a misnomer to recommend a certain percentage of a highly addictive drug, which sugar is by any definition, a limit on it. But we won't even get into that. How does that happen? The USDA every 5 years creates the nutrition guidelines. There's hundreds of billions, I would argue trillions of dollars of implications for those nutrition guidelines because they flow into every other standard and basically set the standard for what every school, what every hospital, what every jail, what every daycare uses. 95% of the people that made the 2020 nutrition guidelines have been directly paid by food and or pharmaceutical companies, Coca-Cola, Kraft. Today, recently checking the 2025 panel, you can't even make this up. More than a fourth of all the announced panel has been directly paid by Novo Nordisk, who's the maker of Ozempic. So more than a fourth of the physicians who are making our nutritional guidelines are on the payroll of an obesity drug maker, which that's a whole thing to dive into why that is. So they pay off the doctors. The doctors go on the USDA nutrition panel. None of these FDA, NIH, USDA panels are bureaucrats within the government. They're all outside experts. So they pay off the experts. And our government actually recommends. So the tragic thing there is that Americans actually listen to medical leaders. When we were told actually smoking was really bad, finally in the 1980s in the Surgeon General's report, there was a big push. Smoking rates have plummeted. It's still a problem, but smoking rates have absolutely plummeted since there was clear communication with the doctor. If tomorrow, and they could do this, tomorrow the USDA said, we're not going to ban sugar, but sugar is leading to a metabolic health crisis among children with skyrocketing obesity and diabetes rates. And we as a government should absolutely not be recommending added sugar for kids. You're not going to be arrested if you give your kid that, but we as a government, the standard, the goal should be 0 for a 2-year-old. If the USDA said that tomorrow, every daycare, every hospital, every pediatric center in the country would abide by those guidelines. And it would actually become more of a social stigma, correctly, to be giving every kid in the world sugar all day. So that's how it all plays out. And I think you make a great point. It's actually less about the consumers. I think the consumer confusion is very important, but these documents are all to give to the decision makers. And I'll just give one more anecdote. It was just instructive. I bet with 40 members of Congress in the past couple of months from both sides of the aisle. These aren't evil people. They all have kids. They are all concerned about what's happening with health. But they, almost to a person, level with me and said, health, I can't understand all this stuff. When somebody comes into my office with all these studies from Harvard, and I'm worried about the, Israel issue, I'm worried about the war in Ukraine, I'm on the committee that oversees the environment, at some point they have to defer. So that's how it all works.
Not to mention malpractice. If say a doctor's tuning into this and does some research and realizes what a healthy diet is to promote metabolic health in a lifestyle, I would assume if they go into practice and start recommending that to patients and it's against the dietary guidelines or a dietitian, they could probably get themselves in trouble not following the higher ups.
This is instituted. So if you go against I talked about the medical organizations recently, right? If a pediatrician goes against the guidelines of the American Pediatric Association, their license could be under threat. I mean, these groups are not like recommendations; they're the standard of care. So the American Academy of Pediatrics, which has accepted millions of dollars from food companies, and 80% of their funding comes from pharmaceutical companies, they make pediatricians give a dietary advice to kids that the first thing a child should eat, the first food they should eat, is highly processed grains. They literally say that they should start with puffs. That's with a document that pediatricians are required. Now, I haven't seen the evolutionary biological imperative to eat processed puffs, and miss the fact that that's what we're evolutionarily made to eat. But that is what the American Academy of Pediatrics says. And if a doctor actually doesn't, if a doctor, for instance, told a child to just, eat some pieces of meat and chew on some vegetables, a big piece of broccoli, they would be under threat. My sister, Dr. Calley Means, who is an advocate on a lot of these issues and started a metabolic health company called Levels, talks about this a lot. But she was reprimanded at Stanford Hospital and during her residency for even mentioning dietary nutrition advice to patients. At one point, a attending surgeon said to her that you didn't go to medical school to give nutrition advice. You're not a nutritionist. Another doctor at one point said, quote, "Don't be a pussy." That soft stuff that doctors don't do. We cut people open. We prescribe pills. There's that's I think how how it works.
And I really feel for people. I think your sister may have been in this boat where they realized it early on in their career. And I guess this is a side point, but if a doctor realizes that before they've paid off all their debt they've accumulated to get all this knowledge and to be trained as a professional, they're kind of in a predicament. Not kind of, they are in a predicament where they have this debt and they've gotten this education, but then they learn that there's this whole other side and they're kind of stuck because they can't practice the way they want. And then the argument could be made even further to a doctor who's, say, paid off their debt, but it wouldn't be to the same extent. You see what I'm saying there? It's very tricky, especially for the new docs who are like tuning into the show and learning, and they're, say, $500,000 in debt, and they're like, okay, what do I do now?
I hear that 100%, and it's something that Casey, I'm helping her on her book, which will release next year, and it's a huge point. Systemically, we have a very dysfunctional situation where the U.S. is a magnet for literally the best and brightest people in the world to come here and study medicine. So think about the system. It's exactly as you said. We then saddle those bright minds who are very idealistic. There's other ways they could make money for the amount they're going to work in medicine, right? It's not the most optimal way to make money. These are mission-based, very smart people going into U.S. medicine. We then saddle them with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt and societal expectations and basically very targeted skills. They are saddled with that. They feel like they can't get out. And then you have the highest rate of suicide among any profession is doctors. You have the New York Times recently reporting that there is a epidemic level of depression among doctors, that the only analogy that they can find is soldiers who were forced by their superiors to commit war crimes. That is what's happening in the medical system. You have idealistic people, soldiers, doctors, coming into a system to do the right thing, and then realizing that the systematic confines of that system are actually pushing them to do things that are actually hurting the people that they got into this to serve. That's what's happening in every hospital in America. And I think every doctor, if they're honest, realizes that they might be prescribing a statin or helping on a procedure to help that patient in the moment, but systemically what they're doing is not helping the American patient. Again, missionaries who are working 100-hour weeks aren't committing suicide at epidemic levels or having epidemic levels of depression. The problem is I think with the issues you're seeing among doctors is that they know they're not helping. So I actually think the system I would describe at a high level as evil, in that it does this. It's wrong. And to those doctors listening, I mean, you've got to be on your own path. And obviously, this is a complicated issue, and there is a need to serve patients within the system. But I personally have been extremely proud of my sister because she had more than $500,000 go into this education. She had it was her entire identity. She did nothing other than work towards this goal, into her 30s. She abruptly quit. I thought she was crazy. I'm like, what are you doing? You've got all the credentials, like muscle through it. She's like, she didn't know what she was going to do. She just quit. And there's life on the other side. She started treating patients, giving them metabolic health advice one-on-one, which led to her having an insight on continuous glucose monitors, meeting some folks and starting out of those insights a company called Levels, which has issued continuous glucose monitors to hundreds of thousands of people, helping them understand their metabolic health, and really, I think, making a huge change in the world. So, that was just in a couple of years after leaving. And she said it was the best decision of her life, even though it was very scary. So I think there is a lot of room for doctors or people in the medical system to step outside of it to make an impact. But I think that is a huge dynamic, and I think it's very scary. So just wanted to share my sister's journey, and I hope that for anyone considering potentially another path, I think it is there because there's so much opportunity and so much frustration right now among the American patient to find answers. I mean, I'm not a doctor. I'm very passionate. I'm on my early stages of a journey for my health and my child's health, and have a company that's trying to change incentives. But the fact that people are DMing me asking for, very specific medical advice with huge frustration, that people I know who have the best medical care possible are reaching out to me with intense frustration. It's like, if they're reaching out to me, there's really a problem. I think there's really a hunger for sane medical advice and a market need for that.
And I think we're in a really unique time right now because of the internet in the last, say, 25 years, where doctors are able to turn on a podcast like this and the veil is lifted and hear the other side of the story, when before, all of us in different ways without the internet were fed information from the top down and just had to go with that and believe that. So it's unique in that people can learn the ulterior narrative due to the internet, creating situations like your sister.
Yeah, I think there's a battle right now where there's a immediate attack on patients doing their own research. There's just an immediate jumping on anyone for spouting medical misinformation, and this like almost belittling of anyone trying to take their health into their own hands, right? This is enforced by two entities. It's enforced by the media and it's enforced by the government. The healthcare industry is the lifeblood of those two industries. So pharmaceutical companies, you can't even make this up, but by some measures account for over 50% of TV news ad spending. Working for pharmaceutical companies, we helped, steer money to pharma ads on TV. one just insight out of that, these goofy pharma ads you're seeing, a little bit of it is to impact consumers and get them to buy the latest drug. But the ad spending is really seen as a tool to influence the news itself. It's very known by the pharma companies that if they're the top spender on news ads, that then gives them implicit ability to steer the narrative of the news itself. And then with the government, the healthcare industry spends 5 times more than the oil industry on political donations and lobbying. It's by far the largest spender. It's the lifeblood of political donations and lobbying. So you have these two entities that fund. You have pharma that funds these two entities that then play referee and belittle anyone for asking their own questions. So, an obvious example is COVID, which was a foodborne illness. You didn't die of COVID if you were metabolically healthy, which is clear. No matter what age you were, it was a disease that preyed on weak immune systems of metabolically unhealthy people. But to even say that, you would be castigated by both the government agencies and the news for being a science denier, for not completely submitting to the fact that this was just a pharmaceutical problem, that we didn't have a pharmaceutical drug. So that's what's happening time and time again. And the crazy thing to me is we don't point out, and if the media was, curious at all and unbiased at all, it'd be, does this system deserve any benefit of the doubt? And of course it doesn't. We're exponentially, healthcare is an industry where the more we spend, the worse outcomes get. So, that's what it buys. And I think, again, the point there for an individual person is there's a lot of incentives to convince you to scare you of taking your health into your own hands, or doing your own research on the internet. And I think it's awesome. I think it's, nobody can stop it of people listening to podcasts, of doing their own research, or reading the books. I think you have less to lose than you think, because the status quo is just not that great. I think you absolutely should be very skeptical. Again, when it comes to preventing chronic conditions, you should be skeptical when your doctor's pushing you to a statin. You should be skeptical when they're pushing SSRIs down your throat. You should be skeptical when they're pushing metformin down your throat. You should be asking what the root cause is. You should absolutely be skeptical when they're pushing your 12-year-old to take a shot for obesity for the rest of their lives, which is what the American Academy of Pediatrics is saying should be the first line of defense for the 50% of teenagers who are overweight or obese. Like, this is a dark path we're going down on, and you should be asking questions.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
The medical system has been an absolute abomination at chronic conditions, which lead to over 80% of U.S. deaths and lead to over 80% of U.S. healthcare costs. That is the conditions like obesity, like